Welcome to this special America First Policy Institute webinar, The Afghanistan Withdrawal, What Really Happened. My name is Fred Fleitz. I am Vice Chair of AFPI Center for American Security, and I am very honored to be joined today by my colleagues, General Keith Kellogg, the co-chair of the Center for American Security and former National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence. I'm also joined by my good friend and colleague, Robert Wilkie. He is a distinguished fellow with AFPI Center for American Security. Robert was the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness in the Trump administration. He also was Secretary for Veterans Affairs. He was a colonel in the U.S. Army and continues to serve his country in the Army Reserve. Robert and Keith, welcome.
Thank you. And hey, Fred, before we get too far and you start hearing the complaints, I have to admit it's the United States Air Force. I've got the rondel on my lapel. I don't want my father turning over in his grave.
Thanks, Robert. Look, there have been many discussions of the disastrous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan over the last couple of years, but to date, there's been no accountability. There have been some perfunctory congressional hearings in 2021 and 2022. There wasn't a serious report by this administration until this past June, and that report tried to mostly blame the Trump administration for the disastrous withdrawal. But that changed this year with the new Republican House, where we're getting serious congressional inquiries by Congress, both reports and hearings. There's been great hearings and reports by the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Homeland Security Committee, and also the House Oversight Committee on this catastrophic withdrawal. I think the most compelling hearing we've seen was a recent congressional panel chaired by Congressman Darrell Issa of California, with Gold Star family members of the 13 U.S. service members who died in this catastrophic withdrawal. And we're going to start by talking about that. What came out in that hearing, and what do our two expert guests with their years and years of military service, what did they learn about the withdrawal, and how did this hearing maybe change their views on this disaster for the United States? So General Kellogg, I'm just going to start with you and ask you to talk about the hearing and tell us how this might have changed your approach to the disastrous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Well, Fred, thanks for having me on, and also with Robert as well. I'd remind Robert he started as the Army Air Corps, but we'll leave it there. Look, when I listened to the hearings with the Gold Star families out in California, one of the things that struck me right off the top was the fact that there was only one news network that actually covered that, and that was Fox News. None of the other news networks carried anything about that hearing. And what you heard in the hearing was quite raw. And I explained that when I was on the newscast later on. And what I mean by raw is these were the families talking about what happened during the evacuation and also what happened subsequent to it. And the very fact that they've never been told actually what happened, and there's been no accountability. The incident that occurred at Abbey Gate, where we lost 13 great Americans were killed with a terrorist attack on that gate. And when you look back on what those families said, is they said, look, somebody just needs to come out and talk to us. And that's the role of the commander-in-chief, or at least the senior military, and I mean the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and talk to those families. It reminded me of when you do the dignified transfer up at Dover, Delaware, when service members that are killed in action come in, actually before they go to the mortuary. And I remember going up to those dignified transfers, and you saw the raw emotion of the families when you talked to them and how they explained what the hopes were they had for their children, what they had planned to do with their families. And then you saw that come out so vividly in that display by the Gold Star family. So again, I'm pretty disappointed on what happened. Now, saying that, nothing really surprised me about that evacuation. It was chaotic. It was a debacle. It was completely uncalled for. There, in fact, was a plan, and the plan was a good plan. It wasn't a great plan, but it was a good plan on how to evacuate Afghanistan and out of Kabul when it was needed. And it was not followed at all. And it was just a hectic non-combatant evacuation. They threw 18th Airborne Corps troops in, led by a 3-star general, C.D. Donahue, brought the 82nd Airborne Division in, brought some Marines in as well, and to be able to evacuate the amount of people that came out. And it was no coordinated effort at all. So nothing surprised me at all, Fred, about the debacle that you saw. It could have been prevented. It should have been prevented. It was not prevented. And then I think the lessons learned, and we can talk about that in a minute, of what happened and what caused that to occur is very important. So this doesn't happen again. This is like, as Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again. It was a mistake. It was a mistake in planning. It was a mistake in execution. Should not have happened.
Fred, I'll add to what the general said, and I think that we have to start with a fundamental approach that this administration takes to military affairs, and we can compare that to the administration that the three of us served in. When Biden came to office, the national media heralded the return of the so-called professionals. I made a remark when NBC's senior anchor said that, well, if you want to find out what the best and the brightest did, you can visit the Vietnam Memorial, because that's their legacy. But when I say that it's a contrast in how we look at soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, this administration looks at people like General Kellogg as just a pin on a map, a subject for a Princeton debating society, not a flesh and blood American warrior who's put into the most trying positions, the most hellish places on the earth to perform incredibly difficult missions. And what we had in Afghanistan was a failure of leadership from the top down. I contrast that with something that happened in my youth. My father was a senior officer in the 82nd Airborne Division when Operation Eagle Claw took place, the aborted rescue of America's hostages in Iran. The day that happened, the day that it failed, President of the United States came on television and said, do not blame the military, do not blame the colonel on the ground, do not blame those in higher command. I did it. This is my responsibility. And I think for the families who suffered this, and it was a disaster of the first order, everything from rules of engagement that only Alan Dershowitz could comprehend, to a failure of leadership on the ground to take responsibility for the troops under command, as well as the senior leadership at the Pentagon, at the White House. This is something that we have not heard. No one has taken responsibility. And I think for those families, and I remember the families of those who fought in Iran, some who lost lives, the notion that the President of the United States was engaged with them and said, it is mine, I am sorry, this will not happen again. That is beyond the kin of this White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon. And I would add to what Fred said at the beginning, that comprehensive after-action report that this White House commissioned was actually commissioned by the State Department, and it is all of 9.5 pages, double-spaced. That, I think, tells you exactly what happened and what these people actually think of those who were put in harm's way.
I want to dive down a little bit on the decision to withdraw, who made this decision, the lack of coordination with the leaders of other coalition members, the failure to consult with the Afghan government. General Kellogg, this is part of this failure. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, Fred, look, as somebody who was very involved with the Afghan withdrawal early on, in fact, President Trump, when they were White House, he said, hey, look, you kind of monitor this from the White House and make sure that we're tracking this with the Defense Department, the State Department. So we brought in Zal Khalilzad, who was actually a negotiator for the State Department. And then we worked very closely with the military as well. And we put together a plan. But it was important to know that this plan started inside the Oval Office with the President of the United States. And what he did is what should have happened with the follow-on administration, with the Biden administration. It was not done. And what I mean by that was presidential involvement. The President of the United States, number one, picked up the phone and called the President of Pakistan, a gentleman named Imran Khan. And he told the Prime Minister, look, you've got a guy in prison that we helped put in prison there, a guy named Mullah Baradar. And Baradar was the number 2 Taliban member He was actually Mullah Omar's designated successor in the Taliban. And he said, look, we need him out because we need to have him as part of the negotiating team to ensure we have an adequate withdrawal from Afghanistan, because we are going to withdraw from Afghanistan, but we're going to withdraw in a proper manner. So Imran Khan, as a result of the call from President Trump, released Berarder. So Berarder went to Doha, set up his Taliban team, and we started negotiations one-on-one with the United States and the Taliban. But President Trump also picked up the phone and he called Mullah Berarder, not once, but twice. And I was there at both phone calls when it happened in the Oval Office. And it was all translated. It was not, because Berarder does not speak English. And it was very clear what President Trump expected the Taliban to do. And so the Taliban accepted what the president said and negotiated in relatively good faith. And before people get excited about that, I remind everybody, when we came up with the Doha Agreement between the Taliban and the U.S., the following year, not a single American was killed in Afghanistan, because President Trump had told Berarder, you kill an American, deal's off. And we were told, the Taliban, that we would withdraw to a certain level. We'd withdraw to 2,500 troops. We'd hold a Bagram Air Base. We'd hold on to that. We'd keep a very strong contingent of CIA assets in there as well, with their forces that were designated to support the CIA. And then we would wait until you had a coalition government. And once a coalition government was in effect and stayed there, and it was successful, then we would talk about further drawing down. The Taliban accepted that. And it's in the Doha Agreement. People can pull that up online. It's an unclassified document, and read it and see that it was a conditions-based withdrawal. What happened after we left from the administration, the Biden administration, is they threw away the Doha Agreement. And once they understand there was no Doha Agreement, and that Biden was not talking to the Taliban, Mullah Berarder, Taliban said, okay, it's game on. And what they intended to do was take the rest of Afghanistan by force. The military had said, well, we've got plenty of time, 6 months or 7 months. Instead, it happened within weeks, because the Taliban was able to roll hard towards Kabul, and they got to Kabul. And then here's another mistake that this administration made. The Taliban didn't want to go into Kabul. They actually offered to the United States our ability to secure Kabul, to withdraw Americans and those designated people we wanted out as well. We turned it down. We said, no, we're just going to control the Harmad Karzai Air Base, with civilian air base. Not Bagram, but the civilian air base, and we'll evacuate from there. It was a huge mistake. And what happened allowed the enemy to close to the gate, towards Abbey Gate and other gates as well. And then that's where the terrorist attack occurred and killed the 13 Americans. So there's a whole series of decisions that were made by the administration that were in fact flawed and wrong. I don't know what kind of advice that his military advisors, Biden's, gave to him at the time. But I will tell you, knowing the military advisors that were there were the same military advisors that we had. And they told us, to include General McKenzie, who was a Central Command commander, that our plan would succeed as long as we followed through on it. And they didn't do that. So the president has to take full accountability and responsibility. In our Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, he's the commander-in-chief. It's on him. Now, unfortunately, once that happened, as Robert said, there's been no statement from the president. There's no accountability that this was my error. I made a mistake on this. But I will also counter that with a little bit further comment, is that the military has a little bit to blame, here as well. Because after 20 years of a flawed policy, we lost that war, a 20-year war. And there's been no accountability at all in the military as well. And I think there needs to be accountability across the board. There hasn't been. And unfortunately, as time goes by, the chance of there being accountability is lessening and lessening. And now we're back to lessons learned again that we learned a long time ago in other flawed military operations.
Yeah.
Robert, I have a similar question for you, but I want to add something to it. And that is, some experts have said that Joe Biden was in a hurry to get us out of Afghanistan so he could do a victory lap on the 20th anniversary of the of 9/11 in 2021. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree with that wholeheartedly, and that's the only reason that that calendar day was pointed to as the day we would be completely out of Afghanistan. I certainly saw it in the aftermath of our departure from the Department of Veterans Affairs. There was an attempt to undo everything that the Trump administration did just because Trump's name was on it. And in VA's case, that included everything from choice to making sure that the unions didn't have a stranglehold on the decision making for veterans' health. But I want to pick up on something that the general concluded with. 50 years ago, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. The scenes there were similar. You had U.S. Marines in the embassy burning millions of dollars of U.S. currency so that it would not fall into the hands of the North Vietnamese. We had people scrambling to get on U.S. helicopters and U.S. planes to get out of Vietnam. You would have thought that we would have learned lessons, but history is never history. If you go back 50 years ago, as the North Vietnamese were violating the Paris Peace Accords, you could see them. You could see them coming down out of the north in a traditional conventional attack. You had a new president, Gerald Ford, and his chief of staff, Don Rumsfeld, and they wanted to unleash the United States Air Force, which would have destroyed the North Vietnamese army because it was out in the open. You can go to the Ford Library and you can see pleas from the Ford White House to a junior senator from Delaware named Joe Biden, who was putting a hold on U.S. authorization to unleash the Air Force to protect our South Vietnamese allies. The very same thing happened. As the general said, President Trump entered into a conditions-based agreement. The Taliban were going to stay in the mountains. They were told if they came out of the mountains, they would be devastated. But not long after President Biden took office, you could see the map changing color. The Taliban began a massive out in the open move toward Kabul that faced no response from this White House. So again, hubris. The notion, as President Biden has said about himself, that he's the smartest man in the room when it comes to foreign policy. And also in terms of what the general said, we not only have that lack of accountability from the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State, but there was no accountability in the military. And to go back to the testimony of those grieving families, the notion that Marine snipers who knew their business and knew their job was to protect their people had the terrorists in sight, and not one person in that chain of command allowed those young Marines to carry out their missions to protect.
Robert, I want to interrupt you for a similar question. This is something that Congressman Michael McCall raised recently in a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. He said that U.S. intelligence, maybe it was military intelligence, witnessed ISIS-K practicing IED attacks against the Kabul airport the day before the deadly attack that killed 13 service members and maybe 180 or more Afghans. And they asked for a preemptive strike to stop that attack. Could you talk about that in light of what you were just discussing?
Yes. The soldiers on the ground, the battalion commanders, the brigade commanders, saw these events unfolding, and requests were made up the chain to respond in kind to the movement of the Taliban toward the airport, the movement of the terrorists toward the airport.
Well, this was ISIS-K?
That's right, ISIS-K, toward the airport. As far as we know, and what we saw in the ISA hearing, and you mentioned Chairman McCall, those requests were denied. And the next day we had the tragedy at the gates. And I think the general can probably speak a little more forcefully to the impact of the chain of command on those who are called upon to be the tip of the spear and how they would react when that situation confronts them at the gate, as it did those young Marines.
Yeah, Fred, you know, Robert brings up a good point. There's a thing called rules of engagement in the military. And what happens is a commander will say, okay, this is what I want to do. When you get involved in conflict, the lawyers come in, but it's still the commander's call at the end. The question is, what kind of rules of engagement? Because if I was a commander on the ground, you give freedom of rules of engagement to make sure that your troops, your men and women, are protected, whatever it takes. But some rules of engagement are very, very restrictive. You can't do this. You can't shoot without permission. And my concern with this administration, especially in a lot of operations, their rules of engagement are very, very restrictive. And let me just use a real quick shift to give you an explanation. Most people remember recently we had the drones being harassed and attacked by both Chinese and then Russian aircraft as well. And we didn't do anything. We basically said, don't do that again. Well, the rule of engagement they should have taken is they should have armed the drones, and they should have told the operators, that those that operate the drones, the next time you are harassed by an aircraft from Russia or from China, you shoot down the aircraft. And that'll stop real fast. We've actually done that before. We actually armed them in Iraq years ago, and we made sure that people understood that this is what's going to happen. These were the rules of engagement. Same thing in the Persian Gulf when they were coming close to our ships as well. When President Trump told them on the rules of engagement, you can go ahead and shoot at anything getting ready or you believe is going to ready to attack you. So I'll close the circle by saying I think the rules of engagement were so restrictive that these snipers didn't have the ability to shoot, and they should have. If they saw a threat, they should have fired at the threat, and then then maybe we wouldn't have had the incident would happen.
And I'll give a real world example of that, Fred, from the general's time in the National Security Council and yours. And that was when Putin's little green men were getting too close to both American and Israeli troops in the Syrian desert. They were given a warning. The rules of engagement were, after the warning, then the United States could unleash that force on Putin's forces. And in the blink of an eye, 300 Putin mercenaries disappeared. They were killed. That kept Putin in his box for the rest of the administration. And that's what happens when the rules of engagement put a premium on protecting the lives of U.S. soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors.
That sounds good, Robert. Robert, I got to move on. I want to stick to Afghanistan if we could. General, I want to ask about the Bagram Air Base, the significance of the fall of the base, the U.S. evacuation, and what we left behind.
Yeah, but this one makes no sense why we evacuated out of Karzai International when Bagram was 25 miles to the north. Major airfield, 2 major runways on there, not one, secure facility. We just walked away from it. It's a base we would build up. But more importantly, with Bagram is that was the site of the largest prison that held terrorists, and we just walked away from it. So between 2,500 and 5,000 terrorists, a regiment of military, was released from Bagram Air Base. It was a facility, even though it was 25 miles up the road. It was a 2-lane highway. We could have controlled the access. We could have controlled the highways, and we could have controlled the evacuation very clearly. And it's something we could have told the Taliban. The Taliban was willing to give us an ability to evacuate. We should have said we're going to hold on to Bagram, and we had always intended to hold on to Bagram under the Doha Agreement. But we could have held on to Bagram to make sure we got our people out of there. And it wasn't just the fact that it was a facility. It was a facility we had actually built. But it was actually all the equipment that we left behind, to include an incredible amount of rations, meals ready to eat, water, equipment. We just walked away from it. It made no sense to me. It made no military sense. From what I understand, the military had told the administration, we cannot do 2 things at once. We can't hold on to Bagram. We can't hold on to Karzai. Well, it's a very simple fix. You bring in the troops to be able to do that. If you're doing a non-combatant evacuation, which they called it, a NEO, then what you do is you bring the forces in to be able to stabilize the situation and have an effective evacuation from the airfield. And Bagram was the perfect place. They didn't do it. Instead, they went to Karzai, which is an airport that is one runway, has a very small maximum on ground ability, or what they call a MOG, and an ability to transport people out of there, and it's just hard to secure. That's one of those that makes absolutely no sense. But again, here's what's important, Fred. Nobody's done an after-action review. I was asking the simple question, why didn't you stay at Bagram? And to the military commanders, why didn't that happen? That's when you close in that circle again. You go back to those families of those that lost loved ones at Abbey Gate during the terrorist attack, is explain to them why we had to come out of Karzai. Why didn't we go out of Bagram? Never been explained.
And could you talk about the prison? Hold on, Robert. Could you talk about the prison general at Bagram?
Yeah, the prison there was actually the largest prison in Afghanistan, and it's where we had held all the terrorists, Taliban or ISIS-K or anybody else, was put in there. And it was a controlled facility that we actually had an ability to operate, which we actually did operate. And then when we just evacuated, we just walked away from it. And they just opened the gates. I mean, this is one of those, it's quite easy when people go, what are you talking about? Pull it up. It's all unclassified. This is what happened. It's in the news. They just walked away and allowed 5,000 terrorists in that range to walk away. It was just made absolutely no sense at all. And that goes back to the planning and asking the hard question, how did this happen? We had never intended to lose Bagram Air Base. We intended to hold Bagram until there was a coalition government. And then once that coalition government was effective, then we'd start to the further withdrawal, but not until then. Instead, they just walked away from it.
Yeah. And I would also add that we just walked away from the United Kingdom, Italy, the Danes, the Dutch. We left, didn't even have the decency to tell, particularly Her Majesty's government then, government that had lost over 400, almost 500 troops in Afghanistan, that we were leaving. And then when the prime minister tried to find out what was going on, could not get his calls returned from the White House. So this is a failure on so many levels. And as the general said, the after action report, we will never see one from this administration that includes not only the military aspects of this, but the diplomatic aspects. And I would just go back to what Angela Merkel said, that those few days probably did more damage to the NATO alliance than any few days in the history of that coalition since it was created in 1949.
Yeah, Fred, this is one of those that just emphasizes what we'd said earlier. This was like a hey you evacuation. And there was relatively minor planning by the military or by the State Department on how to evacuate. I mean, look, you go back to our American embassy, they were in the process of burning files, never given advance notice. In fact, they left a lot of files to include biometric data on people that actually supported us in the fight we had in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. So this is one of those, okay, explain to the American people how this happened. What kind of planning did you have? What was the execution of this planning? And how well was it done? And nobody's talked about that. And the frustration that I personally have is that as time goes by, less and less care to the American people on trying to run this down is going to occur. So this is one of those going to go back into the lessons, the history books of, oh, well, this is a bad mistake. Well, we should have learned from it. Again, but I will tell you candidly, Fred, I put a lot of the blame on the U.S. military as well, because this is something they should have been upfront about. There should have been an after-action review. You could have gone to the National War College here in Washington, D.C., and sat down and said, what actually happened, bringing all the participants in, both from the Trump administration and from the Biden administration, both military and diplomatic, the State Department, and sit down and say, how do we prevent something like this happening again? Instead, what we did, we beat ourselves on the chest and say, look how many people we actually evacuated. Well, that's not a good criteria. We lost a country. We lost a war. How did this happen?
Well, the Gold Star families would say that it's worse than that. They were pretty angry at this hearing. They said they were lied to. They were upset at the military. They were very upset at President Biden. They told stories I had not heard before. One story was that U.S. soldiers were told to clean up the Kabul airfield to leave it in good order for the Taliban before they left. I mean, I learned things, and I saw a degree of anger I didn't expect from that panel. Secretary Wilkie, what was your feelings about this hearing?
Well, my feelings were exactly as you heard those families speak. Again, the priorities were all backward. An artificial date was set so that the president, as you mentioned, Fred, could do a victory lap, strangely, on September 11th, 20 years after the actual attacks. So he could check off the box. And in the meantime, we allowed other forces to dictate how we protected our troops or did not protect our troops. And because no one wanted to take responsibility for the debacle, the families were left wondering what had happened. I mean, why had their young people signed up for duty when they were not being protected, and they were not being cared for by the chain of command? And this goes back to what the general said. I think there are those in the military who have escaped responsibility for this. I do agree with what General Kellogg said. I know most of the people who were involved in the command operations and the planning of this. I cannot believe that any of them would have told the president to do what he eventually did. But that still, that doesn't negate the fact that once that happened, that these families were left to wonder why and how, and really feel the back of the hand from the administration and as you mentioned at the beginning, a compliant media that didn't want to hear anything more about this. I can just imagine if this had been the two Bushes or Mr. Trump, CBS News would be broadcasting 24 hours a day. If this had been a similar hearing based on a debacle that took place with those men in command at the White House.
Hey, Fred, if I could, Robert brings up a good point, and not just accountability, but I think we need to remind people that are listening and those that really care that when you join the military, there's an obligation that what you're doing is you must ensure that, and you know that you may have to commit these young men or women into combat, but that Americans, the parents of America, have given you their most precious asset, their sons and daughters. And you have an obligation to protect them as best you can. And you have an obligation to explain when or if something happens, explain to them what actually happened. And that was not done. One, we didn't protect them as we should have protected them. And second, we gave no explanation to these families. And you saw that rawness come out when those families were in San Diego and they talked about what happened at Abbey Gate. And that was, to me, actually, you'd have to say disappointment is an understatement. But the fact is, it was a dereliction of duty by the commander-in-chief and also by a senior military. There was no military out there during that discussion, and the commander-in-chief didn't say anything about it. And again, it was only covered by one network. But we owe it to those men and women that fall for this nation to explain that to them, and it wasn't done. So that, to me, is one of the big flaws. Not so much the military, what happened, and not so much that we lost Afghanistan. It's that we failed our most precious assets are men and women in uniform, and we just kind of looked the other way. We still haven't answered that.
So I guess you'd recommend that. I guess it's going to take a new administration to do a real lessons learned. Maybe the House can do this, but how would you approach putting together an effort on lessons learned for this catastrophe?
Yeah, Fred, the first thing I would do, military side, if you were involved in any Afghanistan planning, you're not part of the panel. I wouldn't include any of them. You could be a witness or you can make a statement, but I don't want you there to try to explain the flawed decision making you made over 20 years. And that includes some of our most illustrious generals that we've had that's gone through Afghanistan as well. And the second, I do the same thing with the State Department. And I'd say, why didn't we have a plan to eventually think our way through this on how to evacuate from Afghanistan eventually? And ask you, the big question is, why did you try to make Afghanistan a country of Jeffersonian Democrats? That was never going to happen. That's not the way Afghanistan has ever been set. There's an old saying about Afghanistan. It was the graveyard of empires. And you go back to Alexander the Great and bring it forward, and you see the problems that anybody's had in the governance of Afghanistan. So what I would have brought in was some actually good historical professors or people who understand history and kind of explain and walk your way through it, and why that long fight in Afghanistan was flawed from the beginning. Originally when Afghanistan started, we had never intended to stay long term. We intended to stay for short term, kill the Taliban, get out. And then we tried to make it an effort to basically change a nation. And that was a huge mistake. It was a major flaw. How did we get there? And again, I would bring in people who had no association at all with Afghanistan, because that's where you learn it from, is from history. Let them come in, but don't let them come in and explain why Afghanistan was a good deal for 20 years, because it was not. So I set up a panel, and it could be a congressional panel. It could be a panel of people from academia, but I'd bring it in and say, let's sit our way through it and do an after action review. The problem, again, I made this comment earlier, is the longer that time goes by, the harder it's going to be to actually get ground truth. And it's just going to be one of those errors where we've had, but we've owed it to people that have been killed or wounded and their families, and also this nation. How did we lose a 20-year war? And let's make sure we don't have this happen again.
Robert?
No, I can't add very much to what the general said. If I were to convene a panel, it would be of historians as well as former leaders who had nothing to do with the 20-year effort. There's still many out there, many distinguished military leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the United Kingdom played a large role in this, as go to the Pacific, as did the Australians and other allies whose senior leadership were very much in doing what the general said. I worked for Secretary Rumsfeld. That his design was that this would not be a long effort. This was going to be short. You punish the Taliban and you get out. That began to change when people started to buy the siren song of nation building, to create a Paris in Afghanistan. And there's a question, Fred, on the I don't know what the technical term is, but I could see a question about the withdrawal, and that wasn't the withdrawal coming, and that Biden was just doing what Trump did. Well, this is where we get to two very different views of how to conduct operations and what America's interests are. You had two campaign promises, one from President Trump that Afghanistan needed to end, and the second from Mr. Biden that Afghanistan needed to end. The difference was that the Trump version, which is actually the realpolitik version to make the left upset, was that there had to be conditions met. And if those conditions aren't met, we're not going anywhere. The Biden version was, we're going to negate everything Trump said and just get out, regardless of timetable, regardless of planning, regardless of what the advice the White House was getting. And that's the kind of thing that led to this tragedy at the gates of the Karzai airport. So to answer that question, two campaign promises, but two very different views on how to conduct both military and diplomatic operations.
Fred, just so make sure that people that are listening, and they said, well, that's an AFPI position or that's a Trump position. Look, go back and look at what the interview that was held on a national television network by General Frank McKenzie. Frank McKenzie was a commander of Central Command. He was involved with Afghanistan early on, and he was the last commander in Central Command to have Afghanistan. And he said very clearly on national TV, 4-star general, Marine Corps, now retired, said it was the Doha Agreement was a conditions based agreement on how to withdraw from Afghanistan. There was a plan, and there was a plan on how to withdraw, and if followed, it would have been successful. It would have taken time, but that was what we intended to do. And I was involved in it for 4 years. And for 4 years, we planned on eventually withdrawing from Afghanistan, because the reason for that is, why do you want to leave Afghanistan? Is because the Trump position was, and I agreed with him at the time and still do, that until we withdrew from Afghanistan, we could not make the pivot to the Pacific, because all of our focus and all of our strategic thinking was on the Middle East. And our greatest adversary, our greatest threat, was the emergence of China. And until we were able to make that break, we couldn't move to China. So that's the reason why ultimately Trump wanted to leave, the administration wanted to leave Afghanistan, but to leave it in good order. And clearly what you saw happen with the debacle there at Abbey Gate and Karzai International, we did not leave in good order. And subsequently, I believe that has had great effect on how the Chinese look at us and how well. So there's always something that happens when you get an event. There's a flow to that. And the flow to that is bad news, and adversaries take advantage of the United States.
Yeah, we need to talk about that. The world is clearly much more unstable, much more dangerous today than it was when Donald Trump left office. We had this debacle of a withdrawal in August of 2021. North Korea had a huge surge in missile tests in 2022. Putin invades Ukraine in February 2022. The surge from China was enormous starting in 2022. Secretary Wilkie, starting with you, can you talk about what this botched withdrawal did to America's reputation on the world stage, and did it make the world more unstable?
Well, let's look at what happened 50 years ago, when you had the same scenario play out, with people clinging to the skids of helicopters, clinging to airplanes. The great American power was laid low by a third world country. And you had a cascading series of events after that, Fred, which led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and actually before that, Soviet and Cuban adventurism in Africa, toppling friendly governments on that continent, while the United States was still suffering from the after effects of Vietnam and that withdrawal. This withdrawal did many of those same things. It pointed to an administration that was feckless when it came to the lives of American troops, that was feckless when it came to the needs of America's allies, its most important allies, in this case, the United Kingdom and France, Germany, the Dutch, the Danes, the Australians, New Zealanders. I probably left out someone in that coalition. And as a result of that, and also to put on the general's point, the American focus on fighting forces like the Taliban and forgetting the lessons of peer-on-peer combat and preparation for combat against a peer. The Russians began to move. The Russians moved. The Chinese began serious interference with the day-to-day operations around Taiwan. We had the specter of the Chinese foreign minister coming to Alaska and berating the Secretary of State about America being an irredeemably racist country. And the Secretary of State could only come up with faculty lounge pieties about America needing to do better. All of these signals combined to make the United States appear weak and unready to respond to what you've written about quite a bit, Fred, and that is this axis, this Sino-Russian Iranian axis that continues to build and grow influence, even though the Russians have suffered many setbacks in Ukraine.
You know, Fred, the other one, and to piggyback on what Robert was saying, is the reason why Afghanistan is important in national security, when you look at it and into the future, it's all about presidential decision making and the importance of having a senior executive and a very talented team of advisors. It was said that this administration, adults in the room, it's more like kids in the sandbox. Have the advisors that can influence the President of the United States with good rationale on making sure that those decisions are solid and they protect the United States of America. I don't see that. I think the presidential decision making in this administration is flawed. And that is, under the Constitution, there's one guy. In Article 2, Section 2, the president is commander in chief, and he picks his advisors. Excuse me. And that's the fatal flaw that I see here, that until you have that solid decision making, mistakes are going to be made. And this isn't the only mistake that they've made. Just a quick segue. We've now evacuated 5 United States embassies in this administration. We evacuated 0 under President Trump. And that is because of decision making in Afghanistan, those hard decisions, but the planning as well. We started from the first year of the Trump administration to plan on how we were going to get out of Afghanistan. And we employed everybody, diplomatically, the economists, as well as the military. So it was a plan to get out and a good way to get out, a rational way to get out, and none of that was followed. So the flaws go very widespread. That's the reason why you have to have an after-action review. That's why you have to have a study on this to tell the American people and drill it right down to those 13 families that lost men and women at Abbey Gate. Explain to them, we lost some of America's most precious assets, our sons and daughters, and we owe it to you. We owe it to the American people to explain how we got there. And if we don't do that, then I think we have violated all the principles that we should have of a republic.
I have a final question for both of you, and that concerns advice you might give to a new president in January 2025 on what he or she should do about this new Taliban-run Afghanistan. And in light of the reality that we left behind an enormous amount of weapons, that this country has become a terrorist safe haven, that these weapons are probably being trafficked around the world. And I had to say, I don't have a clear recommendation myself, but I'm just wondering if you were to be asked by a new president what his administration should do about this country, or maybe in dealing with the Taliban, what would you recommend?
Fred, this is one of those, if it was a new administration, I think communications is important. And the president of the United States, whoever he or she is, would pick up the phone and call the leadership of the Taliban, much like President Trump did with Mullah Baradar. He talked to the opposition. He talked to the adversaries. It's important. And he clearly lays out our position in the United States of America. And our position at the time was very clear. You kill an American, we're coming after you. We know where you live. We know where your families live. And we're going to make sure you pay a price for that. And make it very clear that do not hit American interests. And you make it very clear to a terror state. And it is a terror state. It's an ungoverned state, Afghanistan. It's going to remain that way because when you look at it historically, it'll never be, to me, a fully functioning state, especially with Taliban under control. But you remind them that we have a long reach, and that if this long reach can find you wherever we want to find you, we have proven that historically. And then you kind of put it over to the side, and we say, okay, we got more important things to worry about: China, the emergence of China, or the Middle East with the emergence of Iran potentially being a nuclear power. And you keep them on the left side, sort of saying, okay, we know where they're at. We've already told them what we're going to do if something bad happens. But we've got bigger things to worry about with the American people. But the problem we had in the past, and I'll close with this, Fred, was we made it the priority. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't have been secondary. It should have been a tertiary effort. And we should have focused on other major efforts that we needed to have solved. Again, China or the Middle East or even North Korea. And we didn't do that.
And I would say, Fred, that Reagan gave us the blueprint after the disaster in 1975 in Saigon, and then the haplessness of the Carter administration that culminated in the desert sands of Iran. The message to the Iranians is that we're going to keep you in your box, but at that time the message to the Soviet Union was that we're back. There's nothing that you can do that prevents us from overwhelming you on the world stage, not only diplomatically and economically, that was a given, the economic part, but we can do things with our technical prowess that you will never be able to match. With a new administration, the word has to go out that we are preparing for peer-on-peer competition. We don't want it, but we're doing that. We're rebuilding our shipyards. We're rebuilding our Air Force. We're doing the serious things that have been required in the past by the United States to deter and, if need be, defeat the most vicious regimes in the history of the planet. But there needs to be a serious refocusing on building America's defenses, rebuilding them, but also making sure that our relationships with those who were cast aside in the Afghanistan withdrawal are invigorated, that we make clear to particularly the Chinese that you are surrounded by friends of the United States, and that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that you stay on your side of the straits. You are surrounded by people who are not only friendly to us, but are military allies, and we'll do everything we can to protect their interests because those interests protect ours. But it's a very different worldview from the one of this administration, which is acquiescence and apologizing for America. If you start from that premise, then you're going to be on the back foot for the rest of your term, and that's what we've seen. And lives will be lost.
Well, General Kellogg and Secretary Wilkie, thank you so much for your participation in this very important and crucial discussion today. I'd like to thank our viewers for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about the America First Policy Institute, please go to our website, americafirstpolicy.com, where you can read all kinds of great analysis and policy papers on all the major issues facing this country today. We'll also be posting a video of this presentation. So once again, thank you, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Robert.